What's up everybody, how's it going? It's Berk, aka Dansgwait here, and it's time for me to talk about and have a look at the Final Fantasy 16 trailer that was finally released after a long wait. The first trailer dropped in September 2020. It came as a pretty big surprise for a lot of people, me included. It was a pretty beefy trailer, it was like over 4 minutes long. But since then, we've barely had anything to go on. We had a few little concept arts that were released and a few information about some factions and that kind of thing. But in terms of like proper trailers, seeing more gameplay, seeing more stories, seeing more characters, seeing more enemies, seeing more premise, we didn't really get that much until last week. Now, it clashed with the time when I was away, so I couldn't bring out anything that was particularly timely. But this was better because, in a way, I got to just chat to some more people, bounce some ideas off, see what other people are thinking, see what the general reception is like. I did a poll on the channel, and so with a bit more context based on what the community thinks as well, and what some of my friends think too, I can share with you some thoughts and feelings about Final Fantasy 16 in its current state based on what we know so far as of June 2022. So in terms of how we'll do this, I guess what I can do is pretty much play back the trailer, and I can maybe pause it at certain points and just maybe talk about anything that's taken my interest or anything I want to talk about. If you haven't seen the trailer yet in its entirety and you want to watch it sort of uninterrupted, definitely go and do that first and then come back to this video, and then you can see me sort of going through it as well. So let's begin. It starts off by saying, in a world ruled by tyranny and turmoil, there are those who would fight to take back control of their fate. This isn't anything particularly special or unique to Final Fantasy. I mean, it's just neutral for me. I'm like, okay, cool. You know, this is just Final Fantasy stuff. Let's see what they're going to show us in this trailer.
Who are we? What are the dominants?
Okay, so straight away, we know that this trailer is going to be focused on the dominants, and of course it just begins with who are we, what are the dominants, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out. We already knew from the first trailer that the dominants are basically the people that have the power of a summon within them, and I'm going to talk much more about this, but this is basically the main reason this trailer exists. They really wanted to show off the summons and the people that have their essence, or you know, their spirit or their power within them. So you can see this shot here, it's almost like neurons in the brain or something, like the way that it's being switched on and it's resulting in like a appearance of an icon. This is Garuda, by the way, a summon that you've never really seen before in most Final Fantasies. I think it's in Final Fantasy 11 and maybe 14, but if you haven't played any of the multiplayer ones, I don't believe Garuda's made an appearance as a summon, so that's particularly interesting to me.
There's going to be another war, isn't there?
Okay. So already I think we need to kind of have a quick pause here. There's already a lot just within those few seconds. First of all, there's going to be another war, isn't there? There's going to be, you can tell from the general atmosphere and the tone and the flow that it might be a bit more of like a war, politics, that kind of one, maybe a bit more Final Fantasy 12 kind of vibes. There's, on Twitter and stuff, there's always this ongoing, Final Fantasy's always been political, and yeah, I think there's always definitely some strong like societal, political, religious themes. We all know that stuff. I don't think that's a revelation to anyone. But in terms of how much they focus on the politics itself, like in terms of like the governments, the structures, the empires and all of that kind of stuff, it of course varies from game to game. And so it seems like this one, maybe a bit more like Final Fantasy 12 comes to mind. That was a little bit more about sort of the empires and the armies of the empires and that kind of thing. I have a feeling that this is going to be much more sort of in that kind of vein. Now, to me, that's not necessarily a bad or a good thing. You can tell an incredibly good story that has much more heavily involved political elements. You can still retain that sort of fantasy style. It just depends on how it's implemented. It does seem like there's definitely going to be quite a lot of politics and war and armies and stuff intertwined in this story so far. Now, Creative Business Unit 3, of course, we've talked about this already in the first sort of trailer analysis and review kind of stuff that I was doing. Creative Business Unit 3, in case you haven't seen that video and you don't know, these guys are the people that are in charge of Final Fantasy 14, and they have basically turned Final Fantasy 14 into an absolute creative powerhouse and a juggernaut for Square Enix. They've done amazing work on there, especially in the later expansions. Even though I've not played it myself, I'm sure anyone who's in some way involved in the Final Fantasy community will know that everyone's been raving about Final Fantasy 14, and it has a huge player base, so much so that one of my friends quite rightly said that he thinks that they are trying to target the Final Fantasy 14 player base quite heavily, because as of this point, in terms of Final Fantasy players that have invested a ton of time into modern Final Fantasy titles, they've probably spent a lot of money on there, and that are really invested in the creative people behind the series, is going to be that Final Fantasy XIV player base. So in terms of both a creative standpoint, because they've done such great work with 14, and from a business standpoint, because they've had so much success with Final Fantasy XIV, especially in recent years, it makes sense to me that they've got most of the team involved in 14 to be working on 16, and they're going to be really trying to target and entice that 14 player base to buy Final Fantasy 16 and to play the game. So you can see the quite heavy influence, and to me it makes sense both creatively and business-wise as well. So Creative Business Unit 3. And then we come to quite possibly one of the biggest points of contention so far. There's a lot of talk and a lot of debate about this stuff, and it's definitely one of the more subjective areas of discussion for the game. The first thing I would say is I've seen a lot of people that are not happy with the UI style of the game. It doesn't really feel as Final Fantasy, the way that everything's kind of been implemented. I'm personally not a fan of this UI either. I'm not gonna front here and say that, oh, I love this is great, this is what I want to see. I don't personally love it either, but I'm not gonna it's just a UI, so I'm not gonna judge it too harshly. But I do think it kind of points a bit more towards what the philosophy and the vision for the UI and the combat style and the gameplay of this game is likely to be. So for people who don't know, in terms of the creative staff involved in the team, the combat director has previously worked on Devil May Cry 5. And what you're going to see in the trailer, and what we would have seen already, is that it does seem more fast-paced and more action, and closer to something like Devil May Cry than to Final Fantasy VII Remake, for example. And I'll talk a bit more about that later, but in terms of like a first glimpse, you can tell from the kind of UI and the small bits and pieces of action that we're seeing that it does seem closer to Final Fantasy XV's like faster action style, but with more, I guess, Devil May Cry influence, and hopefully that means it will be a more refined and better version of 15. Okay, so I'm going to stop it here again. This is some more kind of UI stuff going on. This is what more of the game is actually going to look like. Now again, I'm not in love with the way that this UI looks personally. It doesn't appeal to me that much. But I think again, one of the main topics of conversation is this going to be a single player Final Fantasy, in the sense that Clive will pretty much be the only person in battle for the entire game. The same way that, let's say, you had in Lightning Returns, it was Lightning for the entire game. Now, I'm going to talk more about that later, but all I'm going to say is in terms of the gameplay we've seen so far, just in this little trailer, the snippets that we've seen, it does look like it's Clive by himself. But I think it's far too early to judge whether it's just going to be him for the entire game at this point. But based on what we've seen, that is something that is on the cards, but I think there's a bit more discussion to be had about that, and I'll get to that once I've completed the run-through of the trailer itself. But this is what we can see. Something that catches my eye too, of course, is we have Phoenix Shift in the menu on the bottom right. Now, my guess is that means that Clive can basically, he's the dominant of Phoenix, and he can shift into basically turning into the Phoenix Summon. That's kind of what that looks like to me. And so that's obviously an important element. And we have the fire spell. One thing that I'm really interested in seeing is how the magic is going to be implemented in this game. And the reason for that is because, in my opinion, Final Fantasy XV's implementation of magic was terrible. And it was one of the things that, for me at least, made me lose a little bit of its fantasy kind of style. You can have a Final Fantasy that's much more sort of modern in style. The architecture, the clothing, the technology. It doesn't always have to be the sort of medieval or like, you know, true like old school fantasy style. But I think for 15, the way that they used the magic in that game, it just didn't feel enough like a Final Fantasy game. Now, if you look at 7 Remake, that was a much better example of how magic can be implemented in a more sort of modern looking setting and a modern looking game, because you've got like cars and motorbikes and all this kind of stuff. And so you think like someone firing off a fire spell kind of clashes with that kind of thing. But in Final Fantasy VII Remake, I think they did a great job. 15 with the whole like you mix up, it's almost like a magic bomb kind of thing. I get what they were trying to do with it, but for me personally, it was a poor implementation. And for me, the idea that characters, or at least some characters in the game, have some kind of mastery and ability to use magic kind of naturally or as part of the world, as part of the lore, that's a cornerstone of the Final Fantasy experience. So moving forward, I do want to see more spells being used in the game. And is this just going to be sort of much more to do with, you know, button mashing combos and you've got to guard and you've got to parry and then you've got to repeatedly smack enemies until they die? Or is there still going to be a fairly strong element of using magic, being a little bit more strategic? Maybe there's going to be buff spells and you're going to be using magic a lot more too. So far, we've seen a lot of sword play and a lot of action, But something I'm definitely curious about moving forward is how are they going to implement the magic in this game? And is it going to feel like a bit of an afterthought, like, yeah, it's Final Fantasy, so we'll shove like some magic in there, but players probably won't really need to use it and it won't feature much? Or is it going to be a genuinely like fully functional and useful part of the game like it was in 7 Remake, for example? So those are the kind of things, again, that I'm sort of thinking about as I watch the trailer. So then we start to see a few different moves coming in. Now you start to see the fire element coming in because this guy is a dominant of Phoenix. Now you've got like Scarlet Cyclone, you've got Rising Flames. There's magic spells and then there's infusing battle arts with fire. I think they're kind of two different things. There's being a spellcaster and then there's having the power to turn your blade into something fiery and sort of creating a firebomb when you smack down on the ground. To me, those are two different things. I like what I'm seeing in terms of the visuals, and I'm sure that's going to add a lot to the battle to be able to do these kind of, I guess, icon combined attacks and that kind of thing. But in terms of actual raw, like spellcasting, mage stuff, I do wonder when that's going to come into the game. And it's also another reason why I personally am not too sure if Clive is going to be pretty much by himself in battle for the entire game, because he is just really not a mage guy. He's got like the jump ability, which is much more like Dragoon style. He's got the Phoenix Shift, he's got Scarlet Cyclone, Rising Flames. He doesn't particularly strike me as a mage guy. So him using like fire spells and that kind of thing, to me it doesn't seem like it's going to work as well naturally for his character. So I feel like there's got to be more to it, where there's going to be more party members coming into the mix. They're going to be maybe a bit more mage style. They're going to add a different flavor to the battles. But what we've seen so far definitely seems more action heavy, but with the infusion of the abilities their icon will give them. Because you can see from the names of the abilities and the style that he clearly has some powers and some moves that are influenced by the icon that he's a dominant of. So now in this bit we have something that's also interesting. We have a higher level battle, and again Clive is by himself. So it adds further fuel to the idea that Clive could be by himself for this entire game. But if you look on the top left, what I've seen is that there's different icons and he can switch between their powers one by one. So that's going to kind of potentially take away from one of the things I'm thinking about later on. But you can see that now, for example, he has a wind-based icon at his disposal. If you look at the move names, he's still got jump, but he's got arrow now instead of fire, and he's got deadly embrace. So clearly he's working with a wind-based icon at the moment. So it's one character who can change up his battle style depending on which icon he's working with. Now, I guess, of course, you've got to ask the question, that seems to me like he can master multiple icons and become the dominant of multiple icons. How that's going to work in the game, I don't know. It could be the fact that he really is on his own, but he's going to be an extremely versatile fighter because over time he's going to gain power of more and more elements and abilities and maybe different styles of combat. So again, by himself, but he's level 33 at this point, and you can see the different icons on the top left. You can see Phoenix, I think, is on the bottom. It's the red one at the bottom, but he has the wind one, and then he has what looks to be like Titan in the middle as an earth-based icon. So yeah, he switches to the other one mid-battle, and suddenly again he has a different set of moves. So in terms of combat, it looks like it's going to be action-heavy, fast-paced, but also deep at the same time. And if you're, again, the kind of person that's much more a fan of the old-school style, the ATB, selecting moves and that kind of style, it's not going to be that kind of game. It's pretty clear at this point. You can't really deny that it's going to be much closer to a mix of like 15 mixed with Devil May Cry than like 7 Remake, for example. So that's just how it's going to work. But we do have what looks like an ATB. I don't know if that's just charging up for special moves, so I don't think that's necessarily needed to take a move, but it could potentially be a bit like an ATB, almost like maybe 13s or like 7 Remakes as well. So I still think we've had the snippets that we've had of battle were too small and too fast paced to really break it down and figure out exactly how it works. But I think in terms of its general philosophy and presentation, you can see that it's going to be a lot of fast sword play and a lot of switching between different forms and trying to make the most of your perks and your abilities and your different elements and all of those kind of things. So that's the kind of battle that's been presented to us at the moment, I think.
I unite the dominants, that we may bring an end to the strife, and found a new order to see us unto tomorrow.
Yeah, so that makes it pretty clear that this guy's mission is to unite all of the icons to bring an end to the strife. And you can tell from the gameplay that that's exactly what this guy is doing. He's uniting all of the icons. Okay, so what we're seeing here is this absolutely massive dude who is pretty clearly, I think, the dominant of Titan in the game, because the guy basically looks like Titan anyway, even when he's not in icon form. But you see that Clive is having like a one-on-one battle against him. And on the top left, again, you have 3 different icons that aren't Titan. So it seems to me like, again, you've got to battle these guys one-on-one and basically gain control of their icon as time goes by. And that's part of Clive's journey to kind of gain, well, unite all of the icons and bring order to the world. Yeah, so now we have, for example, we have icon versus icon action. This is going to be pretty epic. I don't know how the battle is going to work once you switch to like full icon. I don't know if it's going to be like a control-based thing or it's going to play out a bit more like a cutscene or like quick time events, but clearly there's going to be some very epic battles going on here between icons. You saw Shiva versus Titan as well, so all of that stuff looks very exciting to me.
There will be losses, it is true. Yet for every citizen who falls, another can be bred. For every home that burns, another can be built. The Empire will live on.
Yeah, so you got this guy's narration, clearly the king/emperor and one of the main antagonists of the game. But clearly the war that's going on, if they're successful, there's going to be a lot of bloodshed. But obviously this guy doesn't give a shit. And so of course it's going to be a journey to see if we can stop these guys basically wreaking havoc and destroying everything. Which again is not like mesmerizingly incredible as a premise, but it's going to be solid and it's going to be all about the implementation rather than, I think, like how incredibly good the premise is at this stage. But you can also see that in terms of the icon stuff, there's a lot of them in the game, and we're going to have to see how this is going to play out, because obviously some of them are going to be on our side, either by default in terms of the story, or after we've gained control of them, they're going to be on our side. But then there's of course the ones that we have to fight against too. So the dynamics there is going to be very interesting. And then of course at the end of the trailer you have Summer 2023 being announced as the release date. Now I had, for a long time, I think when I saw the first trailer in September 2020, I saw 4 minutes worth of trailer and I was like, wait, if this is already this much in September 2020, by the end of 2022, I reckon there's a chance we could see this game coming out. So my initial prediction, I think, was closer to like 2022, Q3, Q4 2022. That hasn't happened. I think as of maybe about a year ago, when I started to see that nothing new was being announced at this stage. And as we got into 2022, I was like, nah, this is not happening this year. It will probably be 2023. And then hopefully Final Fantasy Remake 7 Remake Part 2 in 2024, like late 2024. Or maybe even early 2025, one of the two. So 2023 didn't surprise me. Summer is quite a long time, but I think to me it makes sense. A lot of people, there's a lot of, I guess when a game is this anticipated and this huge and this important, people are going to try to do what they can to try and, you know, get headlines and get hype and get clicks and that kind of thing. So I've seen things thrown around like, you know, the game is pretty much finished or the game just needs polish. To me, it doesn't sit right with me. I know that the developers themselves have said pretty much the game is playable from start to finish, and we're going to spend the remaining time kind of polishing it up and getting it ready for release. Now, to me, it doesn't seem like a game needs over a year. I mean, summer 2023, I'm doubtful that it's June. It feels more like later to me. Even if it is June, in the earliest case, that's 12 months worth of polish. A game being playable from start to finish to me is obviously like good. It means they are obviously very far down the line, but that's also still pretty vague to me. I mean, just because a game is playable from start to finish, to me it doesn't imply that it's that close to release. And so summer 2023 in that context makes sense. So in my eyes, the game being pretty much finished is not accurate in my book. I still think that there's work to be done on the game. It could be on like cutscenes, it could be on dialogue, it could be on voice acting. I don't know what it could be, but in terms of just having a game that's playable from start to finish, to me that does not equal the game's pretty much finished. Like, to me they're two different things. So summer 2023, is there a chance of a delay? To me it seems like it's possible. Maybe they could delay it to like November 2023, or like the first week of December 2023, that wouldn't hugely surprise me. But I still think that there's work to be done on this game. I don't think it's literally just polishing off a few things over the next year to 15 months. I think there's a little bit more to it than that. But in any case, I think this trailer was really cool in general. It focused on an aspect that I think could be important and very strong and set this one a little bit apart from some of the other Final Fantasies. So the first thing I think I want to actually talk about is, of course, the dominance and the reason why this trailer pretty much exists. They really wanted to show off the dominance and the summons and how big a role they play in the game. My feeling from this is that I'm generally very excited about the summons and the icons and the dominance and the way that they fuse this into the story, because summons are always a bit hit and miss. Sometimes they're great and sometimes they're not really utilized that well. Sometimes they're just purely a gameplay mechanic. Sometimes they have a meaningful influence on the story. And so with this one, the fact that they've really kind of embodied summons inside characters and humans, I think makes it very powerful. So like in Final Fantasy X, I think personally one of the things that made summons so cool was the fact that they were connected to the Faith. And the Faith were once living, breathing people who have made a sacrifice in order to help future summoners save the world. And that sort of connection that they had with humanity made them feel much more human. So we all remember Seymour and Anima's story in the game. Anima is just a summon. If Anima was just this sort of badass looking summon that you can summon, there's no real story context for why it exists. It would have looked cool and it would have been cool gameplay wise, but I think what makes Anima, for example, special is the fact that we know the story behind Anima and why Anima exists, and the fact that it's connected to a human being with real thoughts and feelings and emotions and motivations, I think made Anima so powerful as a summon and really iconic in my book. No pun intended. In Final Fantasy 16, the fact that we have almost this Naruto-like situation where there's certain figures in the world that have the power to, I guess, quote-unquote, house icons in their bodies. They can transform into them or whatever. To me, that's very powerful because it brings a very obvious human element to the proceedings, and that's something that I like. So the fact that they're going to feature so heavily in battle and in the story, but in this also very human way, I think is very exciting, and it's something that's not really been done that much in Final Fantasy, in my opinion. They're almost like in Final Fantasy 15, they went the other direction where we had like Gentiana, I forgot what her name was, and she was Shiva, for example, all along. So it was a human that was a goddess all along, and we just didn't realize she transformed from that to her human form to basically watch over us and that kind of thing, which was kind of cool. But in terms of the general idea, they were much more like deities that sort of were so far above and beyond what the normal humans of the game were, that they sort of came along when they felt like it. They felt very distant and very godlike in terms of the story and the lore of the game. But with 16, it seems like they've really pulled them out from the heavens and sort of put them on the battlegrounds and made them much more human and have a much greater connection to the story and what's going on in the world and to the main character. So that's something that I'm in general very excited by, and I think it could make for some very interesting story and very interesting situations as we play the game. So that's one of the first things I'm definitely hype about. The second thing, I still think you can't deny the fact that so many important people from Final Fantasy XIV are involved in this game. Yoshi P, I've mentioned this countless times at this stage, and I think it bears repeating because I've had this conversation a lot in private with people, and so I think it's worth mentioning it more publicly, I guess, as well. Yoshi P, I personally have no experience of his games because in terms of him being a creative force that's at the top of the chain, Final Fantasy XIV is his thing. That's his baby. I haven't played it. All I have is secondhand sort of information from people that have and say that it's incredible. I've always said that I trust the community on Final Fantasy XIV. I've had so many like personal friends who have played it as well tell me that it's fantastic, that it would be extremely cynical and stubborn of me to say, no, I don't trust this guy at all. I haven't played a game of his. I'm not going to be optimistic at all because I've never played anything that he's done. So I do retain my optimism about that. The only thing I mention is that with Final Fantasy XIV, if you look at the credits, it's very deliberate that he is both the director and the producer of Final Fantasy XIV. And to me, that's very important. I've not spent any time in the gaming industry on the development side, but I do have a little bit of experience in the filmmaking world. And that's another sort of creative endeavor where there's studios involved and there's teams and there's hierarchies and there's titles like director, producer, and these kind of things. And to me, when someone is a director and a producer, they are like they are like the god of that project, and they're also very hands-on at the same time, because they hold the two roles, and it's very deliberate that they're given both titles in the game. And so for Final Fantasy XIV, I think Yoshi P really is the guy. Like, he's the man, and he's the reason, the single most important human being in that team for why that game is so great. And so with Final Fantasy XVI, I think what a lot of people didn't realize at the start, because of course Square Enix is very smart and they're using Yoshi P as much as they can as like a marketing figurehead for the game, is that he is a producer on the game and he's not the director. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, yeah, but he's going to be hands-on with everything, he's going to be in control, it's actually really his project. That's all hearsay. None of us really know what's going on in Square Enix's offices. What we know for an absolute fact is that Square Enix could have chosen to make him the director and producer of 16 as well, but there is this little game called Final Fantasy XIV that is making so much money for Square Enix that Yoshi P must devote his primary attention to 14 and ensuring its continued success. And that to me is an important point, and probably the reason why he's not also the director of 16. I don't think he can do both jobs at the same time. So to me, what it feels like, this is again just hearsay, this is just my own personal opinion, Yoshi P is clearly very involved in 16, but the extent to which he's involved at every single level of its development, purely as a producer and not as a director, to me is unknown. And to say that just because Yoshi P is the producer of the game is definitely going to be as good as the recent 14 experiences, or is going to be amazing because he's involved, to me that's a little bit too much. So far, based on what I've seen, I trust that it has the potential to be a really good game, but some people are so completely sold that it's already going to be incredible, even before the second trailer came out, just because he's involved as a producer. To me that doesn't add up, because a good example of this is, let's say, someone like Kitase. Kitase was one of the most important creative minds during the golden era of Final Fantasy, and he was the producer of Final Fantasy 13. He didn't direct 13, he was just the producer. On paper, at least, the same way that Yoshi P is not the director of 16, he's a producer. What happened with Final Fantasy 13? Now, I know that a lot of people, it's near and dear to their hearts, but as a general community sort of review of 13, it's not one of the sort of Mount Rushmore Final Fantasies, if you will, or like one of the top 3 for a large portion of the community. So if your approach was the fact that just because Kitase is the man for so many of the important Final Fantasies that were made in the 90s and in 2001 Final Fantasy X, the fact that as a result that means that this guy being in charge as a producer on 13 will mean there's definitely going to be great, people were wrong about that. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be the case with 16 at all, but I'm just saying that there's a reason why things are structured the way they are, and I think it's a little bit unfair to the director to kind of call 16 basically Yoshi P's project anyway. He's doing everything, he'll be in charge, he's going to run the show, it's going to be, like, if the game is great, it's going to be his success. To me, that kind of is a bit unfair on the director. The director is a pretty damn important human being in the structure of a team. So Takai's involvement in this game is more important than Yoshi P's, because Yoshi P is a producer, Takai is the director. He is the person that has to be the most hands-on with every single aspect of the game's creation. I think Yoshi P, on paper at least, he would be more of like a setting the vision and supervising the project kind of guy, as opposed to Takai, who would be day-to-day in the trenches getting the game made. So I think that's an important note, and I still think a lot of people, because Square Enix of course want those Yoshi P points, the same way that, let's say, when Hideo Kojima's making a game, people will buy the game just because it's Hideo Kojima. Forget what the trailers show, forget what you think about the game, it's Kojima, it's got to be incredible because he's such a genius. I think they're really leaning into that and making Yoshi P such an important figurehead in the game that it's helping to, again, grab that Final Fantasy XIV audience and make sure that every single 14 player is buying the game because Yoshi P is in charge. And like I say, to me, even though I'm optimistic about all of those things, I'm not saying that they're sort of lying to you or that he's not doing anything to do with the game, it's going to suck. I'm just saying that, to me at least, and the way that I see it, his involvement in 16, it's impossible for it to be the same degree of involvement as it is for 14 and for the expansions moving forward. So it's just a little kind of pinch of salt that I think that needs to be taken with all of the involvement of the 14 crew and Yoshi P in particular. So it's just something that I want to mention because I've seen so many people like on social media literally just give me the line that Yoshi P is involved, it's going to be incredible. I'm not that guy yet. Of course, part of that is because I haven't played 14, but it's also because, to me, it's important, the fact that he's not the director and producer of the game. There is another person who is the director in charge of getting the game done. So it's just some food for thought, I think, and it should be interesting, because it's one of those where maybe if it fails, everyone's going to be like, you know, oh, it was the director's fault. Yoshi P had nothing to do with it. And if it succeeds, it's going to be like, oh yeah, Yoshi P, he's a man. Of course he did it. It's his success, blah, blah, blah. So it's one of these kind of he can't lose situations, I think. He's reached that sort of celebrity, mythical status in the gaming community that I think everyone's got his back. And based on what he's done with 14 and how he's revived modern Final Fantasy, I think it's deserved. I'm not saying that he doesn't deserve that, but for me at least, I'm looking at it a bit more sort of from a wide angle with an extra pinch of salt. And I'll just wait to see. If the game is fantastic, then he'll of course get my props. And you can definitely say that he's maybe a better producer than Kitase was, because the games that have been produced by Kitase are not really as good as the ones where he was more of a directorial and writing influence on proceedings. So that kind of stuff is very interesting, and basically none of us know what's going on behind the scenes, but I can only hope that due to the involvement of so many important people in 14, including of course the man himself, that we're going to see a really good game next year. Even the music, the music in the trailer so far has been really cool. Soken has been doing amazing things on Final Fantasy XIV again. Because I haven't played it, I can't say I've heard a lot of it, but what I have heard of him, he's a very talented guy, doing great things, and I think in terms of soundtrack, we're in good hands. So that's something that's always important to a Final Fantasy experience, and so I think that's going to be really cool as well. So in terms of things I'm looking most forward to at the moment, I am really enjoying the premise of the dominance and the icons. I think that's going to be a lot of fun, a lot of interesting stuff. The designs of the icons I've generally really liked. They look very cool. Shiva especially, man. I feel like Shiva is such an important summon, and my favorite is Final Fantasy X's Shiva. I am a little bit biased, but I do think Final Fantasy X's Shiva is amazing. But 16's one looks super, super cool as well. So looking forward to just seeing them in action and seeing how they really link into the story, and sort of seeing their human forms a lot more as well, because they are tied to real people. What are their motivations? What are their stories? How are they going to connect to Clive? Are they going to become allies? Are they all going to be foes? What's going to happen with those guys? I'm definitely very curious to see what's coming next for them as well. I think in terms of the tone, it does seem to me like there's going to be a bit more sort of darker elements to it. I'm not opposed to that. I think that could definitely work well. I'm the kind of person that in terms of stories, I like it when the stakes are high. I do enjoy a bit of those bittersweet vibes. I wouldn't say enjoy is the wrong word, but like, let's say when a game has the balls to, let's say, kill off an important character, I always respect that decision from a narrative standpoint, because sometimes I think it's needed. If you're trying to tell big stories that have massive ramifications on the world and the characters involved, tragedy is going to happen. It's just a part of life. We've all experienced tragedy in our lives. And so these stories where they make the stakes seem super high, but then when you really look back on it, nothing really ever happened to anyone, I'm not always a fan of that so much. Sometimes it works. It doesn't always have to be the case. But sometimes when a game makes a bold decision, or like a movie or a series or whatever it might be, sometimes that's where the magic is. And even though it's painful in that moment, I think overall it serves the story well. And so I feel like this game might be one that doesn't pull its punches in that regard. And so we might see some truly kind of emotional and narratively challenging things happening as well. And so that's something that, again, I'm looking forward to. And I think there's a chance they could deliver on that front as well. So the general tone and the style could be very interesting as well. And it could appeal to me personally in terms of what I like narratively too. So looking forward to that as well. In terms of gripes and things that I want to see more of moving forward, I'm still not a fan of the combat style so far. That's more of a personal thing. I haven't seen anything that makes me think this combat is objectively shit, like everyone would hate this combat. It's more to do with what I like and what I enjoy playing in terms of Final Fantasy. I personally think that 7 Remake's combat system was a really good shot at finding a hybrid between the old school style and the new school more action-based, because depending on which character you were choosing, like let's say when you fought with Tifa in 7 Remake, you could really just have pretty much an action style. You could just be spamming her punches and kicks and throwing in a few like special moves now and then. With Cloud you could do that too, and then like switch to the different modes where you could like really just get going with that sword and just hack things down and swipe things up. But then you could also kind of take a step back. You could fire off spells. The spell implementation was slick. I think it worked nicely in Final Fantasy VII Remake. Playing as Aerith was a lot of fun. Playing as Barret from long range was also a lot of fun. I just felt like they really got close to nailing what the future of Final Fantasy could be in terms of the gameplay and the style, in my opinion. So if you were to just ask, like, what would your vision be for Final Fantasy 16 or Final Fantasy for single player experiences moving forward, I personally would have liked to have used 7R's gameplay as a foundation and sort of worked off that to increase certain doses depending on the style of the game. So take 7R system, but maybe give it a bit more action, a bit more speed for 16, and then maybe slow it down for like a different style of game or whatever it might be. But to me at least, I don't see the 7 Remake foundation in this one when I look at the UI, when I look at the speed, and when I look at the style. I think to me still it looks a bit closer to 15. And of course we have the Devil May Cry combat director involvement as well. So in terms of like its philosophy on that stuff, it doesn't work as well for what I like. But again, it doesn't really mean for me that I'm not interested, I'm not going to play it, or this sucks. Even with 15, for me, that had a pretty poor battle system. I didn't really enjoy that one. That being said, I could have really, really loved that game if the story and the implementation of the story and the characters and everything was on point and they got to have the development and the creative process that they wanted to have, because 15 has had a lot of good elements that didn't really come together in the right way, in part of course due to all of the development troubles that they had during the game. So gameplay is one of those things where yes, I might not love it and it might not be for me, it might not suit my style so much, but if the other areas of the game hold up, it's something that I'm willing to sort of put to the side and still really have a good time with the game. Maybe I won't be as good at the game, maybe faster paced games like Devil May Cry and like that kind of thing, I'm probably more likely to just spam stuff, like find something that works for me and just keep spamming it, and maybe only use like 20% of the combos or the moves that's available in the game. So I might not do as well with the gameplay, but I'll still enjoy it and I'll still make my way through the game and I'll still beat the battles that I need to beat, and I'll still have a good time if all of the other stuff is on point as well. But in terms of just my own personal preference, what I've seen of the gameplay so far is not something that's up my alley. Again, what I do want to see is magic. I want to see how magic is going to work in this game. I think maybe they showed like a magic spell being fired in the first trailer, but in this particular trailer, the little snippets of battle that we had was like, I call them like battle arts, almost like Elden Ring style, where his sort of sword catches fire and he can do like some impressive moves using the power of the icons. But in terms of actually more mage stuff and more like spell casting, we didn't see any of that in this trailer. I personally want to see how that works. Is it like an afterthought? Do they not really want you to play around with that as much in this game? I don't know. That's something that remains to be seen. So I'm not going to make any final judgments yet. I'm looking forward to more gameplay. Maybe some kind of, like, you know, they do these 15-20 minute gameplay section walkthroughs where you can really see how it works. Or maybe releasing a demo like they did for 15. I think that kind of stuff would be nice, just so we can get a feel for how the gameplay works and the speed and how they're implementing things. So moving forward, I definitely want to see more from the gameplay, and hopefully it's going to be the kind of stuff that will put some people's minds at ease, because of course there have been, from what I've seen, a not insignificant number of people that are like, you know, I'm not really a fan of this gameplay style, the UI and this kind of stuff. I've definitely seen a number of people not happy about that. But of course a lot of people that's also very excited by the slick combat and the Devil May Cry inspiration as well. So that's something I'm definitely kind of mixed feelings about, but just waiting to see more in the future. I have two more main points before I wrap this up. The first one is, again, to do with the party and the lack thereof so far. I was discussing it with people and thinking that since all of these icons are connected to people, does that mean that potentially when they're in their human form they could just be party members? And it's an idea I had, but kind of watching the trailer back and watching it maybe more than once, the way that you can switch between the different icons based on what I'm seeing on the top left of the UI, it doesn't make me confident that there's going to be multiple party members. So my thought was, let's say you meet someone in the world, either you fight them and you bring them onto your team, or maybe they're just allies with you to start with, and then they can maybe become sort of party members they can become party members in their human form, and then maybe once you charge up like a certain bar, then you can transform them into their summon version and then use them as a summon in the game or something like that. And I thought maybe what they've shown in the trailer so far is just kind of curated, and they've only shown you the Clive section so far, but maybe in a future trailer they're going to show us a bit more of like, oh, here's what it looks like when there's more than one person on the team that's fighting. So far we haven't seen any evidence of that, and the fact that Clive is trying to unite all of the icons, I think kind of kills that theory, because I think once they're in their human form and they don't have their icon power, I'm not sure if they're going to still be party members regardless. Everyone that's been introduced so far, the icons, some of them look like antagonistic figures, because of course you've got like Hugo, Titan's dominant. He clearly is an antagonist at the start. We don't know what happens later, but at the start he's an antagonist. And so for all of these icons, it's hard to say whether they're a team of antagonists that we have to defeat one by one. Is it a mix or some other thing? We don't really know at this stage. So that's another thing I'm curious about. These icons, are they going to be potentially party members, maybe in their human forms? Or even if they're not party members, are they going to feature heavily in the story and in the journey? Are they going to provide companionship in their human form? Are they all kind of antagonistic to us? Do we have to battle every single one to get their powers? Or are some of them going to be allied to us from the start? I'm generally curious because they're so important to what's going on in the world and the story. We definitely need a bit more in terms of that stuff as well. We've seen them in battle, we've seen they look really cool, and we know that Clive wants to unite them in order to kind of bring balance and order to the world. But moving forward, I would like to see a little more how they influence the battle outside of fighting against Clive and outside of literally being a summon. Is there any other way in which they factor into the gameplay? So that's something I want to see in the future as well. And I think for me the final thing worth talking about is, I would say personally I'm disappointed by one thing. The only thing I'm disappointed by, again, so far it's a creative choice, but we have seen over 7 minutes worth of trailer, and it's been almost 2 years now since we've seen the first trailer. As of this point, I don't believe that in any kind of trailer footage we've got to see any proper shots of the locations in the game. We've seen battlegrounds, so where Shiva fights Titan, for example, it's like this bland sort of rocky, mountainous sort of area. We saw the wide plain where there's the war going on and the soldiers running into each other. But in terms of showing us some shots of what the bloody world looks like, what do these towns look like? What do these cities look like? What do these castles look like? What do these forests and jungles look like? Like, what kind of areas do we even have in these games? I think we've barely seen anything. It's all been focused on Clive. It's been focused on the dominance, it's been focused on the icons, and it's been focused on like one or two kind of political figures and characters in the game. So that to me is a bit of a strange creative decision. Again, Final Fantasy to me, part of its appeal in almost every game is the locations. Whenever we think of a Final Fantasy game that we love, we can all instantly recall our favorite locations. And so that to me is a big selling point. It's a wow factor. Even when I was watching, let's say, Final Fantasy 13 trailers, one of the things that was the biggest wow factor was just how incredible some of the locations looked. Like that first shot of when the party arrives on Pulse, the shot of Cocoon in the sky, some of the earlier shots of what's going on inside Cocoon as well, like the city, and all these kind of things, the Hanging Edge. All of those places look super cool, and I was like, okay, you know, maybe the gameplay is not really what I want to see, or maybe these characters look not so cool. But in terms of the areas that we're going to be playing in, those look really dope, and I can't wait to explore and be inside those areas. So Final Fantasy 16 hasn't given me any of that so far. There is not one shot where I was like, damn, this location looks dope, I can't wait to be in that area. It's been very heavily focused on the characters and the icons, which to me is weird, but it is what it is, and they've obviously done that deliberately. But just as I say that, like yesterday I think it was, or the day before, they did release a few pictures on social media of a few of the locations in the game, which again to me is strange. It's like you've got all of this trailer time to dedicate. Just literally give us like 2 or 3 shots of some locations properly so we can get some more visual context for what the world looks like and what's even happening here. Like, we're talking about the fate of the world and we don't even know what the world looks like. So to me it's a little bit strange, but the few pictures that I did see of the locations, which I'll include right now in the video, again, it looks promising, and it's definitely the kind of thing that I'm looking forward to seeing as we continue forward, because at least, again, in terms of my own personal preference, I'm not too big a fan of the medieval style and look, especially when it's not stylized. So Final Fantasy IX, for example, had a bit more of a medieval kind of style, and for that game it worked well because of the colors and how charming it was. You still had like your airships. It was almost a little bit of a steampunky vibe sometimes. For Final Fantasy IX, I think it worked nice. You can say, for example, that Final Fantasy IV that I played most recently is a more medieval setting, that kind of game. Lots of castles and lots of kind of wooden settlements and that kind of thing. That's all true. But again, because it's Final Fantasy, they tend to always throw in some stuff that keep things interesting and sets it apart more visually. So yes, for example, Final Fantasy IV does have a lot of medieval settings, but a significant portion of the game also takes place on the moon. You have like spaceships that take you to the moon and all these kind of things. So it's not, the entire game doesn't take place inside castles and settlements. So I think Final Fantasy, one of its strengths is that it can combine sometimes these weird magic and fantasy and high technology things with like older, low-tech, medieval style surroundings. So that's something I'd love to see from this game. I don't know what the technology level is going to be like what's the airship situation going to be like in this game. Is there going to be any sort of world changing? Is there going to be some really cool kind of more fantasy looking places like with all of the crystals and maybe some magic that's present in the environment making it look a certain way? I personally would be disappointed if it was much more sort of almost Game of Thrones style, where it was just like, you know, wooden settlements and castles and sort of muddy plains and mountains and hills and that kind of thing for most of the game. What I've seen from the 4 screenshots that they posted is a little more promising, but I definitely want to see a lot more. So in the next trailer that comes out, what I'd like to see is less of the epic kind of Shiva versus Titan. They've used that like 20 times. I want to see more of like the potential story stuff that's going on. I want to see more icons in their human forms. I want to see what the world looks like a lot more, and maybe a bit more of like the magic and the fantasy elements that I'm hoping are still going to be present in this game, despite the setting and the tone that we have. So those are like some general thoughts that I have so far, based on conversations I've had with people, based on what I've seen, and based on some of the feedback that I've read on social media so far about Final Fantasy 16. I think so far so good. Honestly, in terms of what I've seen that gives me any kind of like not hype is probably the battle style, but that's something that's much more personal to me. Based on what I've seen so far, there isn't any, I don't think there's any real causes for concern at this point. If we have another trailer or two and we're sort of, I don't know, 9 months down the line and there's not long to go until release, and I still haven't seen that much of the world, and there's still some things that I'm not really happy in terms of like the gameplay style and that kind of thing, then sure, I'll be a little more concerned overall. But right now, my general position is that I'm excited. I do like the direction they've gone with it. I think it could be a special game, especially because of the involvement of a lot of important people that have helped to revitalize the franchise and produce some excellent work in recent years. So in general, I am excited. I think it's going to be, I think the odds of it being a really good game is higher than it being an absolute flop. I'm pretty confident in saying that, but I also do need more from the trailers that are going to come to help kind of satisfy some of the stuff that I still want to see from Final Fantasy 16. So thank you all for watching. If there is another big trailer in the future, which I'm pretty sure there will be, I'll be doing this again and sharing some thoughts with you guys. So I'm sure there'll be conversations and content about Final Fantasy 16 in the build up to the release as well. But for now, I'm signing off. Thank you all for watching. I will see you soon. Take care.